yesterday I was talking about law and economics, economic analysis of law, and how law looks at what economics says about legal rules. It says it doesn't think, and then changes economic theory so it works better to solve a particular problem, but also to solve then other problems. The most important area where economics has not said anything in the past, or says it has not said anything in the past about, is law and values, and the shaping of values. It's kind of interesting how easily it has been to ignore the role of law as something that forms the values, the tastes, the desires of the society. In fact, in my book, The Costs of Accidents, when I said accident law had certain functions, did certain things, the one thing that I left out completely was the reason for accident law being one way or another because of the values, the tastes, the ways of looking at things which would follow. I just didn't see it. And in that, I wasn't alone. Oliver Wendell Holmes, when he had written a common law for the common law, also didn't talk about law and values, tastes, and so on. Focusing attention on that was something that the critical legal studies school group of people in the 1970s, 80s, first did. They said you cannot pay attention to law without considering its importance in shaping values. Unfortunately, once they said that, the critics had nothing more to say. They said it's terribly important. It's part of what we're doing. Pay attention to it. But they didn't tell us anything about how it worked and what values and tastes were worth shaping. And why law should, how law should work that way. So they called attention to it. They said, here it is, and then they dropped it. In fact, the relationship between law and values is a complicated one. It's a two-way street. When law gets changed, it often gets changed because values and desires of a society have changed. So changes in values are inevitably reflected in a change in time, in a change in law. Classic example of this is in the 19th century, there was a cause of action for alienation of affection. If somebody ran away with my wife, fiance, girlfriend, I had a cause of action against that person. In time, because the degree of ownership over diminished, that attitude diminished, that law changed. And almost every jurisdiction in the United States, every state, has abandoned the cause of action for alienation of affection. But it is a two-way street. So that once the cause of action for alienation of affection was dropped, the effect of that was also to say that after all, people's sexual freedom would be greater. And so it had itself a change in values beyond it. And one sees it, this two-way street, in any number of different things in law. For example, Brown versus Board of Education, the case that declared segregation to be unconstitutional in the United States, could only come about slowly after a series of different things had occurred which made African Americans somewhat more equal. Not very much, but somewhat more equal. That created a situation in which the law could change and declare segregation to be unconstitutional. Once the law changed and did that, Brown itself was tremendously powerful in causing a further change in values. The United States changed dramatically because of Brown. It worked both ways. And so it has been with the decision in Massachusetts that marriages, same-sex marriages, had to be allowed, which could come about because of previous things that had been occurring. But once it came, it was still way ahead of the values of many people. But in relatively short time, it had an effect in changing the values of it, not only Massachusetts, but Vermont, Connecticut, Maryland, you know, New York also went in that direction. In fact, the effect is more complicated still because sometimes a law is changed with a desire to change values in a direction. But the very fact of that law, if it comes too soon in terms of the underlying value structure, may bring about a reaction which is stronger in the counter direction. And values change away from the way law is. Kind of interesting to see the effect of Roe versus Wade, the abortion decision in the United States in that. On the one hand, I think there is no doubt that Roe versus Wade has, among many people, increased the belief in the acceptability of abortion. On the other hand, one can also demonstrate that as a matter of slow changes in statutes, the direction was in favor of more liberalized abortion. When Roe versus Wade came out and decided the thing dramatically, a counter-reaction set in, and so there has also been, among certain people, a much stronger view against. It can happen both ways, and so the relationship is complicated. The most dramatic example of a decision, a law change, bringing about a stronger counter-pressure was the famous 19th century decision of Dred Scott. Lincoln said, "A nation may not stand half slave and half free." Lincoln was a great man, but in that he was wrong. The United States had been half slave and half free for about 100 years. And despite much tension, it was likely to stay that way. It was likely to stay that way because in the North, though it was free, the abolitionists, though admirable, morally, were considered a pain in the neck. They were troublemakers. They were ugomate. They were always there, you know, there churning away, saying, "You've got to be honest with you," and that's not comfortable. A lot of people in the North said, "You let us do our thing, be free, and we'll let you do your thing, have slaves in the South, just leave us alone." Dred Scott was an opinion by the Supreme Court in which Chief Justice Tawney, a Southerner, declared in effect that the country was all slave, that you couldn't have half slave, half free. I always am amused when the South in the United States talks about states' rights and against the imposition of a national thing. The first people to try to impose a national point of view with respect to what they cared about was precisely the South in Dred Scott. Once they did that, the abolitionists became not only right, but what we have to fight for in the North. If you're going to impose your values on us, then we will say, no, it's going to be our way. If it's going to be all one way, it's going to be our way. And that changed values and tastes in the North in the opposite direction from what Dred Scott would have wanted. And ultimately it led to the Civil War and, blessedly, to the elimination of slavery. So when you're talking about law and values, be aware that the relationship is enormously complicated, which may be why, after the critics have said how important it is to making law, that the idea of a torts law isn't only to reduce the sum of accident costs and of their avoidance, as I said, but also to decide what values, what tastes we want to shape. But it works very hard. And to the side, let me say that this fact that law is often a two-way street occurs much more frequently than one thinks. I don't know if you know Richard Eckstein. He's a very important torts scholar in general. He was in Chicago, is now at NYU, and so on. And he has a view of law, of what the right law is, derived from the way we talk about things. He looks at language and then says, if we say, I hurt you, that must mean that I should pay. Our language tells us what our underlying values are. But that also is a two-way street. The way we talk depends on what the law is. If the law were that anybody who was injured had to be paid by the person who injured him or her, and somebody drunkenly and intentionally got in front of a car, and the car then hit him, and the result was, under this pre-existing law, that the car driver had to pay in those circumstances, it wouldn't be long before we found a way of saying that the person who walked in front of the car injured the driver. Our language reflects a legal relationship just as much as the legal relationship affects language. This is all by way of background of law and values. Let me give you an example from my area, torts law, of where the economics of tort law and shaping values, shaping what we feel, are interrelated, before I get more specifically into what law and economics have to say to each other in this. One of the hardest areas in torts law has to do with purely emotional damages. Typically, in the United States, but in most countries, one cannot recover damages unless there has been emotional damages, unless there has also been some kind of physical harm. That is, damages that flow just from an emotional reaction usually are not recoverable. If I do something negligent that scares you, then even if a fright leads you to some physical loss, typically that is not recoverable. Now it's odd, in a way, if we want to put costs on the activities that cause them so that they take them into account in deciding how much they do. If that's the economic way of doing things, then why shouldn't emotional damages count just as much? And yet, typically, we don't give them. And the extreme example that is usually used is there is a horrible automobile accident. You have driven negligently with the result that you two are lying mangled, bleeding on the street. You did it negligently. You're responsible. I drive by and I see this scene and I feel sick. Typical. It's not just something quirky of mine. The ordinary person driving by will feel sick. Why shouldn't I be able to recover from you for that? After all, it is a cost of what you did. It is a cost of that activity. And yet, typically, we don't do it. We don't give recovery back. Well, I think the reason for that is that if we give me if we give recovery to people who feel sick in that situation, if we give people a right to recover in that situation, what we actually do is cause people to think it is my right, it is something I have a right to, and they feel worse. They feel not just slightly sick, as we all do when we go by, but they feel angrier, sick and angry, because you did that to me. That is, my values, my tastes are changed by the fact that I have been given a right to recover. And that increases the amount of harm, actually, that your negligent accident caused. The harm is greater because it has changed my tastes and values. And because of that, I think, we say, no, we would rather let you off, not make you pay all your damages, than create more harm by infringing on my rights, by saying that it is a right. And what's interesting is to see when we do give emotional damages. Because, of course, by saying I have no right to recover when I pass by an accident, it makes me more callous, harder. Changes my values in the opposite direction. And that may not be something we always want, or it may be. Typically, a situation where we do give damages for purely emotional things are if a child is killed and her parents, his parents, see that and feel terrible, we give the damages. And we give them there because even though there too, if you give a right, it makes the damages greater, we don't want people to become more callous in that situation. That would be terrible. We don't want people to say, oh, well, too bad. So there, we would rather increase the costs by changing values in that direction than diminish the cost by changing values in the opposite direction. And most of the rules that have gotten developed in this area are kind of nice technical rules which somebody who teaches torts has any amount of interest in and play and would bore you to tears, which would be a change in values. And I'm not going to go into them. But the fact is that if you look at them all, they all have a question of how important is it to deter what you did in relation to the harm that is caused by it and the danger of making the harm greater by allowing me to change my values in a direction of feeling infringed upon, as against making my harm less by telling me I don't have that right. Now, some of you will think again about what we were talking yesterday about capital punishment and the right of a family of victims to feel hurt or not hurt, to have a right to redress, and that. It's all the same kind of thing. Okay? Now then, what does economics have to say about all this? What does economics have to tell us, if anything, about tastes and values? Since these are lectures in law and economics, I guess I should come to that rather than just stay on things indoors. Well, if you look, if you read what economists say, they tell you we have nothing to say about tastes or values. The classic economic position is de gustibus non disputandum est. Concerning tastes, there is no dispute. We have nothing to say. Tastes are what they are. We economists take tastes for granted. What they are, whatever you happen to like, despicable though I'm sure it is, whatever you like, admirable though it may be, and then from there we go and decide what is efficient or what is distributionally just. But in any event, we take that as a starting point. You like bananas? You hate bananas? We have an efficient way of distributing bananas, and one which is distributionally just, so that you don't get bananas and he gets bananas. And about that, we have nothing to say, is what the Economist says. It's not true. It simply is not true that that is what economists do in practice. That is, I think I can demonstrate again and again that economists, while they say that, typically value some tastes and ignore some others. Act as if some costs, which is the other side of values and tastes, are not there, and treat others as very important. And it's quite important when you read analyses by economists to look to what tastes and values they are in fact asserting and which ones they are ignoring. Because very often it is that which leads to what I said yesterday, the application of an economic theory to a situation in law, and then saying, that is not explained, it must be irrational. It is because some values and tastes are either asserted or ignored. Let me start with an example which is critical, and where there is no reason whatever for making the mistake the economist makes. There's a man named Dred Scott, who used to be at Harvard and now is at Vanderbilt, who wrote an article talking about tort law and saying that extra compensatory damages, punitive damages, were irrational, those were his words, in the case of people who took airplanes and whose luggage was lost. You know, you take a plane and typically you fly somewhere and you get there and your luggage ain't there. And you can't find the luggage and you sue the airline, and normally they give you the value of the luggage they lost. But in many jurisdictions where the airline behaved with even more stupidity than it usually does, they will give you punitive damages, extra damages against the airline. I had that very much in mind because I think it was not the last time I came to Turin, but the time before I came to Turin, we flew from Rome here, and my luggage got sent to Bari. Well, if your luggage gets sent to Bari, it's inevitably lost. In fact, there was no way of getting it back until one of my former students, who is a professor in Rome, but also in Bari, went to Bari and found it at the airport. The airline was not going to do anything about it. Well, Viscusi says that people in that situation have a right to get the value of the luggage and no more. That giving them extra payment for it is irrational. Why is it irrational? Because he says, this is the value we give to the luggage, why should we get more? But that says that the extra value that I give to my luggage, because I am a luggage lover, is not to be taken into account. Well, maybe as a lawyer and as a practical arrangement of things, that may make sense. But as an economist who says, de gustibus non disputandum est, why should he tell me that I can't love my luggage? If I have, in terms of my other article, property rule interest in my luggage rather than a liability rule interest in my luggage, what's so irrational about my having it? I happen to love luggage. Or even if I have a thing about luggage when it is lost by an airline. That is, I may love something in a particular context. I value my life more or my luggage more in a particular context. And so, if you are going to do something to damage it, I want you to pay to deter you from doing that. Again, whether that is a good rule or a bad rule of law, maybe another matter. The decision as to what tastes and values are good or bad is an important legal issue. That's what we started talking. But the economist who says, I have nothing to say, any value is as good as any other, can't tell me that it is rational for me to love my luggage. Treat it not as lost luggage, but an airline damages my private parts or damages my head or something of that sort. No one would think it's irrational for me to say that is worth more than what the market values my privates. Privates may be worth very little to the market, but may be worth a lot to me. So, why is Viscusi saying this? Well, notice he might be saying something else. He might be saying, well, it raises the cost of travel a lot, and it is difficult to make the people who value their luggage that way pay for it. It's hard to say, yeah, you like your luggage, so you have to pay more for your tickets. And therefore, we don't want the airlines to pay. Now, notice that if that is what he is saying, that he's saying that what is bad about the rule of punitive damages in that situation is that I am getting something that I don't pay for. The one word you don't want to use about my wanting to get that is that it's irrational. It's perfectly rational for me to want to get something I don't have to pay for. That's more than rational. In economic terms, that's eminently good sense. So, what you have to say is that what is going on is that Viscusi is actually saying, I don't like this value, and even though I am an economist, and I'm not supposed to have anything to say about it, I'm actually telling you that I'm moving it out of the system. Then I'm not treating it as there. And that's why I tell you, be very careful when you look at law and economic analysis of law, at what underlying value assertions are actually being made by the economist who does this. Let's take some things which are a little more complicated in that. Yesterday we talked about how economists don't treat altruism, beneficence, as an end, but only as a means. And why they did that. When they do that, they are saying valuing beneficence, valuing altruism is not something we do as economists. But that is taking a stand, again, on tastes and values. They are saying we're only interested in it as a way of producing health care or producing something else. We are not interested in it as something that people may actually value. And it is because they have made that judgment that they have had so little to say about how much not-for-profit, how much altruism we actually have. And by the way, I forgot to say this yesterday, but one sign of how much we actually value altruism, not-for-profit, beneficence, even in a market way, is how much we are willing to pay the CEOs, the chief executive officers, of not-for-profit institutions. You know, running a hospital, which is a not-for-profit institution, is a hard job. But it's not that much harder than running a small firm. And yet, typically in the United States, people who run not-for-profit hospitals have salary levels which are much higher than that of ordinary for-profit firms. Why? That's an interesting question. One reason may be that we value people who can run things that are altruistic well because we like it. It makes us happy. Think about the amount of money that the people who invented, the entrepreneurs, the innovators, who invented things like Facebook and all these terrible linkages among people that are not directly financial. I don't use them, I don't understand them. People keep saying, link me in, and I say, and so on. But people evidently like it. They like it precisely because it is a non-economic way of being in touch. We like it enough that we're willing to pay the entrepreneurs who invented it a huge amount. All these are ways of saying that people actually value this. And again, traditionally economists pay no attention to it. But there are more important ways still. One thing that economists typically do not take into account is interpersonal utility functions. The fact that I am upset, that I don't like it, if you are willing to sell your body parts to somebody who wants them for a transplant or for something else, because you are poor, or because we don't want to put a value on them at all. The fact that I don't like that hurts me, and so I tend to stop that from happening, is something that typically economists will not take into account. They won't take into account the fact that there are some goods that we do not wish to value at all, to put a price on at all. The fact that there are some goods which we would only be willing to price if they could be bought by everybody equally, rather than according to the prevailing distribution of wealth. That is why so often economists can't deal with the existence of some goods which in practice the law takes out of the market. We take out of the market minimum health care. We take out of the market all sorts of other things like that, minimal education. We don't like to have a market for political action completely dependent on how much money people have. We don't have markets in body parts, in rights to children, in all sorts of things which, why not? Part of the reason is that I don't like the idea of your selling yourself, even if you are willing to sell yourself. There are some economists, Chabelle and Kaplow at Harvard, who say that is, taking these out of the market violates Pareto, because the person who sold it was willing to sell. You are willing to sell your nose or your hair, and so why shouldn't you be allowed to, just because I don't like it? And they say that's Pareto inferior, because you ought to be able to do it. But if I don't like it, that you're able to sell yourself that way, that is just as much a taste. And you can't say that what you are doing is Pareto superior, because Pareto superior means no one is made worse off, some people are made better off. But I'm made worse off, unless I don't take into account my values. Now that's very important, because an awful lot of law can only be explained precisely by the fact that my utility, my desires, are affected by what you do. And when economists don't take that into account, they're taking a whole lot of values and simply ignoring them, acting as if they are not there. Acting as if they are not there. And I'll have more to say about why economists do that. But remember, the economist says, of tastes I have nothing to say. But in effect, they are saying that my taste, my value, that you should not sell your nose, your hair, or your private parts, is one that should be taken into account. Now maybe, from a non-economist point of view, that's a good idea. Sometimes it may be, sometimes it's not. That is, if we're not talking economics, if we are talking other things, sometimes we may say, no, I don't want people to be affected morally by others. That's another question. But the economist supposedly tells us, I have nothing to say about that, but instead does all the time. Let me tell you one other example of costs and values that economists ignore, because it's a rather funny one. I've written an article called The Pointlessness of Pareto, which says we are always at the Pareto efficient point. We are always at the Pareto optimal point. If we were not, and there was a point where some people would be made better off and no one would be made worse off, we'd obviously go there. Why wouldn't we go there? If there were a point where some people would be made better off and no one would be made worse off, well, of course we'd go there. So the fact that we're not going there must mean that at the moment, knowing what we know, we're already there. And by the way, the same thing is true if you do a more complicated Calder-Higgs analysis than a Pareto. The economist says, but you see, people don't understand that there is this point, that if we rearrange things, we could get to a point where everybody would be better off and no one worse off. To which I say, that's fine, but it costs something to get people to understand. There are costs of convincing people that if we move from here to here, everybody would be better off. Why are you ignoring those costs? Why do you treat those costs as if they weren't there? They are just as real as a cost of improving the situation from this to this as the cost of finding something that reduces inertia so that cars run better or trains run better. That is, we can always move the Pareto curve outward if we learn more, if we find new ways of doing things, of organizing things. Why should you act as if the costs of restructuring the economy are not there, but the costs of an invention in physics, chemistry, or bananology were real? The interesting thing is that the costs that the economist ignores are essentially the costs of paying the economist. And the ones which they treat as being real are the costs of every other discipline's making an improvement. That they are in theory no different. Now, why do economists ignore these costs? Sometimes, like Viscusi, they ignore them because they are actually doing the judgment that economists say that they cannot do. They are taking a stand on what values they think are good and what values they think are bad. And they may be right, but they are not doing it in an open and honest way. They are not doing it as a scientist, as a scholar. They're simply saying, that's the way I look at things. Which is fine, except you don't want to hide it as being a scholar. And there's a danger in doing that. When I wrote The Cost of Accidents, I said, this is a better way of arranging accident law than the previous one. There's nothing to the contrary. Well, to the contrary was that an awful lot of trial lawyers would have been poorer, because the system would have achieved certain results for victims, diminished accidents, without the need of many lawyers. To me, that was clearly a plus. It wasn't so to the trial lawyers. I wrote another little article saying that when Posner describes rich and poor as alike in distributional terms, he's being disingenuous. But I said when I ignored the wealth effects on trial lawyers, I was being self-indulgent. I was acting as if I knew what was best, even though it was a non-scientific way. In fact, when I proposed a change from the state of Hawaii that asked me to make a change in automobile law, and I chose it for Hawaii because you could do it in Hawaii, since people don't drive from Hawaii to another state, so changing the law of Hawaii wouldn't make difficulties of conflicts of laws and other things. All the people, the legislature and the governor, were very happy and we were going to put in this reform, which was a wonderful reform, until the trial lawyers, who would have lost considerable money, bought halftime during the Super Bowl, the Super Football, it was like the World Cup, to make ads against it. And were able to defeat it. And boy, those ads cost a lot of money, so you know how much money was at stake for them. Okay, so that's sometimes what's happening, simply that the economist is exercising his judgment as a non-economist to say that he or she does not like some values. And that's easy enough to criticize. More interesting is where the reason the economist ignores certain tastes and values is because it is difficult to introduce those values into an economic model. It's hard, we said yesterday, to treat of altruism and the value of altruism and beneficence as an end, because you cannot buy altruism in a market without destroying it. How much must I pay you to love me for myself alone is meaningless. How can I command you to love me for myself alone is meaningless. And the only way it can be worked in is through heavy, semi, demi markets, heavy, semi, demi commands, and making a structure of markets and commands which is much more complicated. And economists say it's too hard, we won't do it. Now, when that is the reason that economists don't do something, that may well be right. Because if doing it reduces economics to something which is less rigorous, that cannot be as modeled, it may destroy the utility of economics in doing what it can do. But two things then come up. First, is it really true that that can't be done? Or is it just that it's hard? Remember again, Coase in 1920s saying, economists typically say that markets are costless. If markets were costless, there would be no firms. There are firms. Markets, in fact, cost. Why should economists ignore that? Well, it was easier to ignore it. But it wasn't then that difficult to introduce the costs of markets into an economic model. Sometimes you didn't need to do it, but when you did, then you could speak to that issue. So, my question with respect to altruism, and it will be even more with respect to the other things that I said, is it really that difficult for economists to introduce those values, those costs into their system? Can they do it without destroying the rigorousness of the economic model? And how important is it in order to explain the real world? That is, if it isn't important in order to explain the real world, then why should economists make life more difficult for themselves by introducing these values? It makes perfectly good sense to say, we will assume they don't exist. They should do it more openly and say, we will assume they don't exist because it makes for an easier model. Well, we do that all the time. We simplify all the time. Nothing wrong with it if you do it openly and say, we will ignore values A, B, C, and D because it complicates things and it's not necessary. If you're not talking about altruism, you can treat markets as if they are pure markets and command as if it's pure command in any number of ways, situations, and do fine. But there are any number of situations where you cannot explain the world as it is, legal rules as they are, without introducing these things. And it's then that the lawyer in Lawyer Economist says, I'm sorry, economist, if you want to tell us what makes sense to do here, you have to make your model more complicated. That is, you take the risk of making your model more complicated so that it doesn't work, or if you don't do it, of being irrelevant to what is a sensible legal rule. Then economics can't speak to that. And that is most important when we're talking about what I was saying of merit goods. Taking into account interpersonal utility functions, how I am affected by your choices, whether I am offended by your sale of your nose, your hair, or whatever, in some circumstances, is hard. And for a lot of situations, there is no reason why economists should bother. They can tell us something which is useful to us about the real world without doing it. But when you're talking about things like merit goods, like a minimal amount of education, a minimal amount of health, and various things like that, then ignoring the fact that I am offended by the fact that you are willing to sell yourself because you are poor is to be irrelevant. Is to say that when you say the world doesn't fit, you're telling me nothing of any interest in what the world should be like. So I can say to you, economists, either here do the harder job and include those values and be true to yourself that you are including the values that are there, regardless of what they are, or say, I'm terribly sorry, economics can't tell you anything about this, you'll have to look to another discipline. You'll have to look to some other way of testing. And, you know, I happen to come out of a law and economics background, so I'm not happy if the economist says, I'm sorry, I can't speak to it. I leave it to the sociologists or to the bannerologists or to the whatever ologists there are. But that is also going to be true sometimes. Sometimes economists can't tell us much. On the other hand, since they can do a lot, why can't they introduce into this? And in the book I'm working on now, I show how if you do take into account interpersonal utility reactions, economists can tell us a lot about how to handle different merit goods, whether we want to give them away equally, whether we want to ration them in a particular way, whether we want to do it by command, any number of things which then economists can help if they're willing to do the harder job. The most obvious example of where cost is ignored and where it need not be is what I just said about Pareto optimality. If what you're concerned with is what you can do within economics, then it's perfectly sensible to ignore the costs of moving to the Pareto frontier that an economist bears by convincing people it's not being there. But if the issue is how much money should we spend on economists and how much money should we spend on physicists in terms of making the world better, then ignoring the costs of moving to what economists call to the frontier and changing the frontier is to leave out the very question. How much money is it worth? What helps us more to spend on this rather than on that? And that is in the shortness of it, the easiness of it, almost the tail of what I've been saying so far, that it is very important for us all in looking at what economists say about tastes and values. When they say, I ignore them, they are irrelevant, to see instead which ones they are focusing on, which ones they are ignoring, and whether in the particular context of the particular legal question we are asking, they are right or wrong to ignore them, or whether if they ignore them, they become irrelevant to the question of whether this is a good law or a bad law. Okay, having said that, let me take a step backwards, or step to the side, and tell you something different, which is that I think that there are things that economists can tell us about shaping tastes and values, which are in fact terribly important, and that no one else can do as much or as well as economists. Economists have never been willing to do it, but I think that economists, using the skills of economists, can tell us some things about what laws, what legal rules may be more desirable for a society, and which ones may be less so. If we have no tastes or values at all, then no one can say anything about which tastes or values are better. Okay? That much I will give to economists when they say, de gustibus non disputandum est, we have nothing to say. But if you allow me to assume only two values, tastes, which most of the time I think in fact economists assume, then we can start saying some things about tastes and values. One of them is more is better than less. A bigger pie, larger utility, is better than smaller. You know, that's a value. And it's a value that economists assert all the time. It's the essence of economics. Let's say, make the pie bigger. So let's take that as a value. And the second value I want you to allow me is some distributional choice, some distributional preference in that pie. And it doesn't really matter for what I'm going to do what your distributional preference is, but if I can assume for a society a distributional preference, then I'll take the next step. So let's assume for a moment that this is a society that likes more rather than less, a bigger pie, bigger utility, bigger happiness, and prefers a more equal distribution of that pie to a less equal distribution. Just the distributional choice can be different. The analysis becomes different if you take that. But let's just take that. Bigger pie and more equal distribution of it. The moment you allow me those two values, just those two basic values, I can tell you, really as an economist, that all subsidiary values for things that are relatively unscarce, that are relatively available, will allow you a better joint maximization of these two underlying values than underlying values tastes for things that are scarce. That is, if that society which wants a larger pie and a more equally divided pie values only high particle or low particle physicists, athletes of extraordinary ability, movie stars with sexual organs of remarkable proportions, great wines, you're not going to get both a larger pie and a more equally distributed pie at as large a joint value than if that society values ordinary good wine, ordinary sex, athletics in a more common way. Why is that? Because in order to develop more of the things which are scarce, like extraordinary athletes or actors and actresses with remarkable bodies or whatever, you need incentives. You need more incentives than to develop that which is commonly there. To make a great, great wine costs a lot more. Takes more incentives than to make an ordinary wine. And where you need incentives, you need either a carrot or a stick. That is, I either need to pay you more in order to spend the time to develop it, or I need to hit you if you don't do it. But either one, paying you more or hitting you if you don't, creates inequality. So that to the extent that a society likes things that are relatively common, that society will be able to do a better job of joint maximizing larger pie, more equally distributed pie. Well, that sounds all very interesting, but what does it tell us about practical laws? Not that much. Let me add just one additional value. That this society likes a pie that is greater, a pie that is more equally divided, and also likes creativity. Enjoys being creative. Now that's a value that isn't very hard to assume. Most societies have, whether it is myth or truth, most religions, that we are made in the image of the Creator. I don't know. Whether it's myth or truth, the fact that people say it suggests that we like to create. It tells us something that is empirically true of most societies, that people like to do something which is creative. Now think about these three basic values and what underlying values then allow us a larger joint maximization of these three basic values. Again, that which those underlying values, secondary values, that allow people to be creative in ways that are not scarce, that are more common, will allow a larger joint maximization of creativity, size of pie, and equal quality of distribution of it. What am I talking about? I'm talking about a society that values, that gives value to handicraft, to home creativity, to home art, to local sports, to good local cooking, and not just to the three-star Michelin restaurant. A society that has those subsidiary values is one which is going to allow you the larger joint maximization of the three values that are positive. Laws affect what we value. We can pass laws which downgrade for other reasons which may be good. Arts and crafts, local singing, local plays, local creativity in favor of highly specialized, highly technical, very good. It's like saying we can downgrade ordinary sex and only value the pseudo-sex which we see from great actors, athletes, I'd say, I best say that. But not just that. And by the way, let's just stop here a second. Often in a country like the United States, people say, isn't it interesting how happy people are in Italy? Well, they're not happy in the United States. Could it be that in Italy people value good home cooking? everybody running around every Sunday looking stupid in shorts rather than big athletic thing. You know, that in a way, without thinking about it, some countries which we think of as being larger, more equally distributed pie with creativity has made choices in its legal system which have furthered those values which allow a greater joint maximization. But we don't think about it because economists haven't done the job which they are most suited to do, which is complex joint maximizations. You know, who can do that well? What skills does it take to do that? Exactly the skills of economists. That's what they're doing. So make these three assumptions and see what happens. But I'd like to suggest to you that perhaps the most dramatic example of what happens when you do these three assumptions is in another. What is something that is highly creative, available to virtually everybody in a society, that does not require extraordinary skill, training, and things, and which is very much under attack today in our legal system? Bringing up children. You know, bringing up children is a highly creative activity. There's a lot of drudgery in it, but it is a highly creative activity that is available to most people. You don't need to be highly specialized to get the benefits of a creativity of bringing up children. Now, there are good reasons why we have passed laws, done things which have diminished the value of that. Because we want equality between men and women. And traditionally, bringing up children was something that women did. And so in order to make women more equal, there has been a tendency to say, that isn't really a worthwhile job. Go out and do something else. You know, what we value is if you go out and spend the whole day hammering something in a factory. That's a job, bringing up children. That's not something you should be doing. But when we do that, we create greater equality at a tremendous cost because we remove a highly creative activity from one which we value. The moment we focus on this in the way I've said it, I think the answer that comes up immediately is, of course we want more equality of women, but there are different ways of doing it. One is to say bringing up children is highly valuable and men should do it just as much as women. It's something that should be done jointly. It's something that should be done by everybody. In other words, there are two ways of having laws that push for more equality of women, one of which preserves the value we give to a highly creative activity which is not rare, and the other which destroys it. Now at this point we said something which is very important, that an economist doing joint maximization can tell us about the society. Then the society can choose one way or the other. Then the society can choose. But they have told us something about values, tastes, their shaping, that otherwise we might not have seen, and in fact which we have been ignoring. So, the end of my story about shaping tastes and values is this. Shaping tastes and values is a very important part of law. Often economists ignore some tastes and values because it makes their life more difficult. Where it does, they should be more honest about the fact that they are ignoring, they are treating some values as not being there, and why they are doing it. And then we can choose whether what they say is relevant or not. And sometimes we can urge them to do more, to become more complex, to take into account interpersonal utilities and so on, so that they can speak to us. But beyond that, economists, if they would be just a bit more courageous and make a few assumptions as to the underlying fundamental values of a society, which are not that different from the assumptions that they make all the time, they could then use the skills which they have, we have as economists, more than anybody else, to tell us things about underlying values which are worth preserving rather than worth doing away with, so that then as lawyers we can decide how to deal with that situation. Now doing that would really be using law and economics in a way which would be as important in the future as what the things that Coase, and perhaps even I 100 years ago, started out doing, and making the future of this field really quite exciting, rather than being simply economic analysis of law, stick things into a machine, churn it out, and come out with the same old sausage. So, this is the end of my tale. On the other hand, I'm happy to answer questions about what I've been saying today, or for those of you who were here before, about what we were talking about the other day, or again, anything else that has come into your mind about what I can tell you as an American judge who is also a teacher and who also looks at the world of American law and others in ways which may be of interest to you. I am, at the moment, also just a resource for you to ask any questions that may be useful. So. She studied with, in China with a guy who was my associate dean at the Yale Law School. So she's got to be good because he learned an awful lot from her.
I have a question about the values. That I agree that economists should take into account the values. And my question is, because values are so subjective and there are so many kinds of values in the society, and should they take all the values, and is it possible? And if it's not possible, who got to decide which values are more important than others?
Which values should economists take into account in what they do? Well, that depends really on them and how much they want to do. At the moment, they say they take into account no values, but they do, because they say larger is better than smaller. I think, probably, if I were an economist starting out now, I would start out making assumptions only about values which in that society can be taken for granted. That are sufficiently accepted so that you can say what I just did rather simply about creativity, distributional preference, and large size of pie. And just do that and see how much even something as simple as that tells you something then about laws and joint maximization. Once an economist has done that and seen that it can bring out some suggestions which are important in law, I would hope that they would become more daring, more courageous. But that would require them to know more about a particular society. That is, an economist who knew China could say, in China, we will assume these three values, let's say, but also a value about tradition. let's see what happens if you accept that as a value. Now, to the extent that people are saying, no, that's not a value we want, then what the economist will be saying is irrelevant. But to the extent that the economist makes an assumption as to a basic value like that, which is by and large accepted in that society, then that economist can tell you something about subsidiary values that is very important for that society. Now, it doesn't mean that that same combination of fundamental values is the one that ought to be assumed for India, or for Australia, or for the United States. There might be another equally important value, and at that point, the economist becomes relevant to the extent that the assumption he makes about a fundamental value is a correct one for that society. But nothing wrong with that. We're always making assumptions and then doing scientific work from there. It requires a certain amount of courage because somebody else can criticize the economist and say, no, that value isn't one that I think applies to this society. Fine. But that doesn't make the work any less scholarly, scientific, or useful. And it helps us do enormous things, so long as the economist is honest. So long as the economist says, these are my results, taking into account these three values plus this one, or plus this one and another one. And of course, the more you introduce as fundamental values, the more complicated and useful the joint maximization is. The more the economist can tell us through a complicated model that I can't tell you today without doing the model. And in a way, that is simply the other side of the coin of the values that the economist chooses not to take into account, which are there, like my feeling unhappy about his selling himself, because it makes the model more complicated. That is, all I ask in all of this is that the economist be open about what the values he, she is considering and what the values he, she is not considering, because then I can tell whether what has come out of the model is something that is useful to me in telling what laws I should push for, because they push for values that lead to that better joint maximization. So that what we're doing is really the same when we're saying to the economist, tell us that you ignore these values, and I'll tell you whether you're relevant or not. Tell us that you are including these values in doing a joint maximization, and I'll tell you whether you're speaking well to my society or speaking only well to China or to India or to another society. So, very important question, and right and point. But you see, to the extent that the economist has traditionally denied having anything to say about values, we don't even get to that point.
Do you think that behavioral economics
A little louder.
Do you think that behavioral economics
behavioral economics
somehow fills this gap?
Well, doesn't fill the gap, and I'm very glad you brought it up, because I think that behavioral economics is one example, and a very important example, of doing what I call law and economics. That is, it is an example in a particular area of saying, we played economic theory, we looked at the world, and it didn't explain some things in the world, so let's change the theory, and we call it behavioral economics. What was the example? Well, the classic example is, from behavioral economics, is that if I have something, I am less likely to sell it than I am to spend the money to buy it. That was something that economists traditionally ignored, and which all of us knew instead was the case. I mean, I knew it because when I graduated from college, my roommates and I said, let's buy some wine and put it aside so that at our 25th reunion, we can have a real feast with a decent wine. And we didn't know anything about wine. It was 1953. We went to a good wine store and said, what's a good wine that's likely to last? And the person said, well, here's some Mouton Rothschild, 1953. You can buy it for about $7 or $8 a bottle. And I think it's going to be a good wine. So we bought 3 or 4 bottles of Mouton Rothschild, 1953, and we put it aside. 25 years later, that had been the greatest year in the history of this greatest of vineyards, and each bottle was worth several $1,000s. We would no more have thought of going out and buying 4 or 5 bottles to celebrate our 25th reunion. We'd never have done that. On the other hand, we had those bottles and we weren't about to sell them. We sat there and drank and had a very good time. Well, that insight was the insight that behavioral economics picked up on and has done any number of things with. What I am saying is that important though that field is, it is just one subcategory of what I am asking be done under the rubric of law and economics instead of economic analysis of law. And I like to think that before law and economics, that before behavioral economics was even there, if you read the book Tragic Choices that I wrote with Philip Bobbitt, that many of the things that I was doing there then were even things which today would be called behavioral economics, as well as this other stuff. So I think it's terribly important. And it's interesting, when I gave a talk to my faculty on this stuff that I'm doing, Christine Joels, who is one of the leading young scholars in behavioral economics, just got very excited because she recognized it as being something which put that very important field in its context. So I'm very glad you asked that because I meant to say something about where it fit.
I have a question. So you spoke about the 2 ways in which law and society are in relation, and the way in which law somehow shapes values in society. So could you please talk a bit more on this with your perspective of a judge? So how in your experience, how far can you go in your decision to shape the values in society?
It's, that's again a wonderful question in terms of a judge. How much, when you are a judge, do you take into account the fact that what law you make will affect society? Put yourself in the position of Margaret Marshall, the Chief Justice of Massachusetts, who, before the second W. Bush election, is faced with the question of whether a law prohibiting marriages among gays, same-sex marriage, was unconstitutional. She can say, we are not ready to say that that is unconstitutional, and wait for things to move in the direction in which they are already moving, but very slowly, and create no immediate reaction, counter-reaction, but slow down something which she believes should be furthered. The result would have been that we might today be where we were 10 years ago in terms of gay rights. Much slower achievement. On the other hand, it probably is the case that W. Bush would not have won that election because her decision stirred up so much anger among the Christian right, so-called, that they came out in large numbers to vote for him in opposition to what she had done. She was my student many years ago, an immensely interesting person, born in South Africa, left South Africa because of apartheid, and started all over in the United States. And we talked about it. And what was interesting was that her reaction was ultimately, I cannot worry too much about whether it causes a counter-reaction or not, because as I look at the law and equality of rights in a more fundamental way, I have to decide this way. And if it leads to what I hope it will lead, so much the better. If it doesn't, I have still done my job as judge. She was remarkably formalistic, if you want, in terms of looking at the sources of law and saying what was called for. With that, contrast the position the Supreme Court took on interracial marriage. After Brown versus Board of Education, the question of whether marriage between blacks and whites could be prohibited was a perfectly obvious question. As a matter of law and looking at legal topography, you could not possibly say that segregation was unconstitutional in schools and other things, and yet people couldn't marry each other. And yet the Supreme Court took nearly 10 years before they would accept such a case, because they were afraid that that was such a hot topic in the South that it would undercut the whole move towards desegregation, which was difficult enough to achieve at the time, but the whole value pressure in that direction. And so they ducked one case after another until finally, 10 years later, they came out with Love versus Virginia and said it's unconstitutional. From a legal, moral point of view, one can't help but say the Supreme Court was wrong. I mean, you know, this was unconstitutional. And human beings were being kept from marrying who had a perfect right to marry. From a broader political point of view, one has to say the Supreme Court was very careful and managed probably to accomplish more quickly. I don't know. You know, I don't know. I think, and by the way, it is so easy to decide it wrong. In terms of Brown versus Board of Education, they then decided that desegregation should come in with all deliberate speed. That was the decision. Desegregate with all deliberate speed. My judge, Justice Black, who was from the South, and who had started out as a Southerner with all the bigotry of Southerners, but had learned and had become the pillar, the leader of the integration, equality movement, and a very great figure in that, said that once they decided Board of Education, he thought all deliberate speed was a mistake. That what they should do is say, these children go into this school now. And if another case comes up, those children go into that school now, rather than saying, well, we want it moderate, we want to take it more slowly, he said, it's not going to work, the South is going to resist, we'll give them an inch, Southern, I know it, they're going to try to find ways to fight it, it's a mistake. He went along because he thought it was so important for the court to be unanimous. And so he did. And it was a mistake. I think all deliberate speed, though it seemed the more moderate way, turned out, in terms of values, to be costly. Because it allowed the South to say, oh, this isn't really the way law works. They're not being lawyers, they're being judges, they're being something else, and therefore we can resist. What do you do if you're a judge in that particular situation? I think ultimately you look at the particular case and decide what you think is going to work best. You know, there is that saying, do justice though the heavens fall, that old maxim. Saying, that's nonsense. If a judge caused the heavens to fall, that judge wouldn't last 2 days. He'd be kicked out. She'd be kicked out immediately. Can you imagine? That judge caused the heavens to fall. Get rid of that person. Judges are, after all, part of a legal political system. And they have to take into account the effects of what they do. They take that into account, guided by the landmarks of the law, to do that as much as they can. But ultimately, one reason you cannot expect too much of judges is precisely that judges are also going to be aware of the legal political consequence. And that in some way we want them to. We want them to less than, that is, we want them to push for those values which the Constitution or which the underlying structure of law tells them to push for. But we do tell them to be careful. Now, in this respect, since some of you are going to be academics, I hope, contrast the academic. The academic should write, when you write an article, what you think is the truth, though the heavens fall. That is, you as an academic need make no compromise. If you think that this is the way the law should go in terms of legal topography, in terms of the values, you as an academic have a duty to write that. And you can do that though the heavens fall. Why? Because the heavens don't fall. Because as an academic, you can be ignored. You write the article that says that, and then people of the world, if they are not ready to buy it, because it would be too dramatic a change, will say, he never met a payroll. She never held a job. It's just academic. It's just theory. And they ignore it. For a time. Because you see, you're writing law, you're not writing mathematics. You're writing about the real world. And so in time, people in the real world will pick up what you've written and use it in ways that will change the world, hopefully for the better, without causing the heavens to fall, because they will do it in all the mixed political ways that they do it. You have to tell the truth. I can't stand academics who get annoyed because they've written an article and the world has ignored it. They don't understand their job. There was a great man at Harvard named Paul Botto who wrote an article about habeas corpus, and the next year the Supreme Court ignored it, and he never wrote again. Because he was so insulted that the Supreme Court ignored it. Unfortunately, I know it was a wrong result, but 30 years later, the Supreme Court bought it. By then, he was dead. He would have written a lot more intelligently bad articles. In the meantime, he didn't do it because he didn't understand what his job was. Your job as academic is to do just that, whether you are ignored or not. I wrote the decision for accidents and other things, and I told you the New York Times then said, oh, blah, 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 for safety, anything. Fine. In fact, the problem was that if anything, people picked up my theories too soon. I mean, I was scared, you know. But I thought, gee, these are wonderful theories, but can they really be applied that quickly or so on? But that isn't, of course, my job. My job is just to speak the truth as an academic, and then let others do it. One silly story on this. There's a great professor at Harvard who became a judge ultimately. His name is Bob Keaton, and he, with a student of his named O'Connell, proposed some changes in automobile accident law, which were very interesting and very good, first-party automobile insurance. And he proposed some of these to the legislature of Massachusetts. But in proposing them, he didn't propose them fully. He proposed them in a kind of compromised way. And an old Irish politician in the Massachusetts legislature asked him, why did you not propose them fully? And Keaton talked a little bit about this, a little bit about that, and the politician kept asking him until finally Keaton said, well, I didn't propose it fully because I didn't think that the legislature would be willing to pass it fully. I didn't tell the whole story because I thought it wasn't politically feasible. To which the Irish politician said to him, Professor, you tell us the truth. We'll make the compromises. You know? You write it as you fully believe it. Let us, people of the world, make the compromise. The difficulty of judges, returning to you, is that we're somewhere in between. You know? We are not the politician making the compromises, but we're not also just the academic. What we do affects people immediately. And that makes us both people in the world and people here. And there's no, you know, it's a beautiful question, something I ask myself. I ask myself that question in every single case I have. Because in the small, that issue comes up every time. To what extent do you push a little bit further? To what extent don't you? It's one of the reasons the job of being a judge is so interesting, especially if you are a judge, as happens in an American system, who can also be an academic. There is a fiscal incompatibility. I can't be paid twice, obviously, but there is no juridical incompatibility between doing the two jobs. And the fact that I look at myself from a scholarly point of view, when looking at the judge, allows me maybe to see that more, sometimes than even judges who are not as self-conscious about that and the difficulty. It makes it a great joy. Grazie mille. Thank you.